They told Denzel Washington this would be a friendly discussion on a panel show. They said they wanted to explore his latest film and discuss moral responsibility. That was the intention. But tonight, Denzel had questions of his own. He sat among 4 panelists under bright studio lights. The mood was polite, but fakery lingered. The host introduced the group and then turned to Denzel. He said, "Denzel, thanks for joining us. Your new film explores moral courage. Let's start there." Denzel nodded. He said, "Thank you. I believe courage matters more now than ever." Panelist 1 spoke next. She said, "It's a powerful theme, but moral courage can mean different things to different people. How do you define it?" Denzel leaned in. He said, "I define it as acting on principle even if it costs you your comfort, your reputation, your position." Panelist 2 said, "So are we talking whistleblowers, activists, everyday heroes?" Denzel said, "All of them. Moral courage lives in quiet corners and in headlines." Panelist 3 added, "Some would say moral courage is subjective. What one person calls courage, others call cowardice." Denzel said, calmly, "That's true. Real courage shakes the ground." The host nodded. He said, "Let's get specific. There's been criticism that this panel avoids naming names, moves around truth." Denzel, thoughts? Denzel paused. He said quietly, "If we avoid naming names when it matters, that's cowardice." A hush fell. The lights felt brighter. Panelist 4 shifted in her seat. The host said, "Cowardice is a strong word." Denzel said firmly, "It's sharper than silence." Panelist 1 said, "Are you accusing us of cowardice?" Denzel said, "I'm observing that avoiding tough truths when you're on camera, that's what cowards do when cornered." Panelist 2 looked tense. She said, "We're here to foster conversation, not to ambush." Denzel said, "But a conversation without honesty is a performance." The host nodded, softly. He said, "But sometimes names hurt. We want the conversation to be inclusive." Denzel said, "Inclusivity isn't an excuse for evasion." Panelist 3 said quietly, "Name names, then." Denzel's gaze locked on her. He said, "I'll start with silence. Silence is the first sign of cowardice." Another pause. The host said, "That's poetic, but vague." "Who are you pointing at?" Denzel said, "I'm pointing at any voice that softens their language when confronting injustice because they fear backlash." Panelist 4 looked away. She said softly, "We're not afraid." Denzel said, "Yet here we are, shying from specificity." That's proof enough. The audience shifted in their seats. The moment had changed. Panelist 1 said, "So what do you want us to do?" Denzel said, quietly, but with power, "Name the injustice. Call it out, and stand by it." The host looked at the panel. He said, "That's confrontational." Denzel said, "It's necessary." Studio lights dimmed for the next break, but this wasn't a pause. It was a crack in the conversation. The cameras returned after the break, but the atmosphere had shifted. The polite tones were gone. What remained was tension, sharp and undeniable. Denzel Washington sat up straighter, his voice ready to land the next blow. The host cleared his throat. He said, "Before we continue, Denzel, you said we should name names. Who specifically are you calling cowardly for silence?" Denzel's eyes swept the panel. He said deliberately, "You." He paused, letting it settle. The host leaned in. He said, "Me? Would you call me cowardly?" Denzel shook his head slowly. He said, "Not you, when you ask questions. Cowardice is silence after you already know the answers." Panelist 1 blanched. She said, "Are you accusing us, the panel of 4, of cowardice?" Denzel said, "Yes. You all sat here when Charlottesville happened. You didn't name the white supremacy that marched. You spoke generically about violence, and then moved on." Panelist 2 said, voice trembling, We hosted experts. We denounced violence." Denzel said, "A denouncement without naming doesn't stick. It echoes without meaning." Panelist 3 tried to interject. She said, But if we name groups, Denzel cut in. He said, you risk sponsors. You risk followers. So you gaslight the moment. Label it complexity, then move to the next story. Panelist 4 looked down. She said, that's not fair. We're not afraid of sponsors. Denzel said, prove it. Name them now. The host tried to prevent a breakout. He said, let's keep things balanced. Denzel said, balance isn't neutrality. It's code for abdication. Panelist 1's voice was tight. She said, what exactly do you want us to say? Denzel said, you want me to say? Fine. Say it. Say the names of the politicians who passed voter suppression laws. Say the CEOs who fund environmental damage under greenwashing. Name them. Panelist 2's voice cracked. She said, that's aggressive. Denzel said softly, it's necessary. Because appeasement is cowardice. The host's voice wavered. He said, you think this panel is appeasing? Denzel said, yes. You dance around real issues, guns, race, pollution. But you talk about all sides and then do nothing. That's cowardice in action. Panelist 3's eyes widened. She said, we cover these issues. Denzel said, you cover them like spectators, not participants. Like you're afraid of making someone uncomfortable. Panelist 4 said, voice small. We report, we don't lead. Denzel said, then don't pretend you're leading. Pretending is cowardice. The air crackled. The audience sat unmoving, absorbing the confrontation. Panelist 1 took a breath. She said, do you think panels have responsibility to push back harder? Denzel said, yes. Because words matter when they're public. Soft words change nothing. The host nodded slowly. He said, so we should name them. But that brings liability. Denzel said, liability isn't part of truth. Cowardice is. Panelist 2 looked at Denzel. She said, and what do we call ourselves if we refuse? Denzel said, silent. Complicit. Another long pause followed. The host looked at his colleagues. He said, let's pivot. Denzel, is your film about a man who refuses to stay silent? Denzel nodded. He said, yes. A man who knew that silence would cost lives. Panelist 3 folded her hands. She said with emotion, and people will call him extreme. Denzel said softly, let them. Panelist 4, voice shaking, said, how can we mirror that courage on this stage? Denzel said firmly, by naming what's hurting our communities. By standing there even if they call you liars. The studio lights dimmed again. But this wasn't a pause. It was a crucible. The panel had been exposed. The question now hung. Will they speak truth or shrink back? The studio lights buzzed as the cameras rolled again, the atmosphere thick with unresolved tension. The host cleared his throat, voice measured but strained. He said, Denzel, your challenge stands, naming names. Are you willing to stay until they do? Denzel met the panel's eyes one by one. He said, I didn't come here for applause. I came for truth. If this stage can't hold it, I'll leave. Panelist 1 drew in a breath. She said quietly, we could name some. We could call out politicians restricting voting access. Panelist 2 nodded, voice shaking. She said, and companies greenwashing climate policy while polluting water. Panelist 3 spoke up, tone low. She said, and media outlets spreading fear without context. Panelist 4 finally looked up. She said, we'll name them, and we'll follow with action. Denzel sat back, eyes steady. He said, then start now. The host, taken aback, said, do it. Panelist 1 spoke first. She said, Senator X, who pushed voter ID laws that shut out communities of color. She paused. Panelist 2 continued. She said, Company Y, which promoted eco-friendly products that damaged rivers. Panelist 3 added, Network Z, that sensationalizes crime to sell ratings. Panelist 4 said, and political leaders who silenced dissent under the excuse of unity. There was a collective exhale. The panel had named names first. They had answered the call. Denzel said softly, That's moral courage. It won't save them from backlash, but it saves you from cowardice. The host said, voice even. Thank you for answering. This is far deeper than scheduled. Panelist 2 said, voice steady. She said, we'll follow up. Investigate. Hold them accountable. Denzel nodded. He said, then this panel has purpose. The room shifted. The lights felt warmer, less glare, more sincerity. The host turned. He said, Denzel Washington, thank you for calling us out and for helping us reset the conversation. Denzel said quietly, thank you for choosing to speak. This is the USA Liberty. If you've ever felt afraid to speak truth in the moment that mattered, know this. Silence is the easy way out. Courage comes when you name what's wrong, even if your voice trembles. Subscribe if you believe the world needs more voices willing to call out cowardice, even when it's easier to stay silent. Because real change begins when we dare to say the names.